Thanks, Abhijit. Welcome, everyone. We're going to take about a quick 30 minutes today. I know that everybody is super busy right now and trying to do a lot of adjustments in a very uncertain time. But we thought we'd take about 30 minutes and cover the topics you're seeing here on the screen today. Why does MPS Interactive even know how to do a webinar about taking things and facilitating them online? Defining what online facilitation is, talking about a couple of the most popular tools and some key tips and ways to use them. Things you should consider when you're trying to move programs to online, or how you are going to incorporate different facilitation concepts for the content that you're bringing in. And then we'll wrap up with a few tips and tricks. MPS Interactive, we're part of MPS, a company that's been in the learning business for 50 years, and MPS Interactive is almost 30 years old, and we really focus primarily on digital learning. So our entire existence is based around creating learning materials that you can provide online, whether those are facilitated or self-directed or are enablers to learning. So we have a lot of customers who are really feeling concerned at the moment about what can we do, considering some of the challenges that we're all having globally. And so we thought we'd just share some of the things that we've learned along the way and that our customers also either have incorporated already or are thinking about. And just so you guys know, it's weird, right, to be in a webinar where you can't really see everybody else. And we'll talk about why that is and why it's a best practice for this type of public webinar. But we thought we'd just share with you, based on registrations, who's in the call with you, kind of what industry or background they might come from. That helps us, but it's also interesting to know who else is out there listening and trying to get tips and understand that we really are all globally trying to work together to learn how to create and work and live in that virtual online environment. So let's define it a little bit. Live and recorded facilitated online sessions. Okay, so live sessions, very similar to what we're doing here, where you've got a facilitator or a subject matter expert or a team of individuals who are working together to present information to an audience. Now, the audience can be quite varied. So this, for example, is a webinar where you tend to have more of a talking head or a presentation style, where people are listening, but maybe not engaging. Now, we'll talk a bit about how you can change that. You can make really interesting facilitated webinars where you do have interaction and audience participation. But one of the things we want you to keep in mind about a public webinar, if you're doing it for marketing or awareness, general socialization of ideas that isn't part of your company, is that you don't always know exactly who's coming to that call and what their expectations are. So one of the reasons, or the best practices for keeping video and audio off, which is set by the host for a webinar, is to make sure that you have a little bit more control over your time, your content, and who's participating. When you have a webinar that's within your own company or within known and trusted participants, then you can really include some of the elements like video for all the participants, discussion, some of the other tips and tricks that we're going to take a look at here in a minute. Classes are another really popular, and I think one of the bigger focuses for a lot of you who've joined today. How do you teach online? How do you facilitate discussion, courseware? If it's normally been an in-person type of content or presentation, how can you move it to a facilitated version and still, keep some of the richness of it that is typical in a face-to-face or in-person environment, but be able to do it virtually? So we'll talk about some tips there. And while we're not really going to focus on meetings today, a lot of what we're talking about is relevant to meetings. Use of the tool, how you can set expectations, how to present and share content. Those things are important because we're spending a lot of time in meetings on these tools as well. So we're going to talk about live, we're going to talk about recorded. There's two ways to look at that. We're recording today's session. It'll be available for playback and sharing to other people later. And that's with an active audience or with an audience that's joined us. You might have that version of recording. You might also have recordings that are just your expert presenting information without an audience and without other types of interaction. So we'll take a look at both of those. On the screen here, we have a couple of the most popular virtual platform tools. Join Me, Cisco WebEx, Zoom, which we're using today, GoToMeeting, Hangouts, Microsoft Teams, and Skype. And so that's not an exhaustive list. It's also not a marketing pitch. These are some of the most popular brands that we come across. Though you may have a proprietary tool in your organization or school or university, you may use a different tool. There are hundreds out there. So we thought we'd take a second and just do a quick poll. Abhijit's going to pull the poll up on the screen here for you. And we're going to ask you which of these tools you know and use for online webinars and classes. So
you've got another 10 seconds to complete your poll. I see that people are, it's interesting to see these graphs dancing around. So I'm going to end the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And I'm just going to publish that for you.
So results are on your screen now. What's really interesting is, as the host, you get to see as people are voting. It kind of is a little bit more entertaining because you're seeing which numbers are going up and changing. And then we publish it so that everybody can see it. It's good to see. So GoToMeeting's pretty popular there, and Zoom is pretty popular. Skype, we have a lot of customers who use Skype as well. And then WebEx is still got a good percentage as well. So let's do one quick second poll before we talk about this a little bit more. If you currently deliver training, what are some of the ways that you're doing it, or what's the percentage that you're spending? Do you have mostly classroom, a blend of classroom and virtual, mostly e-learning, or a blend? Where are you now? Now, it's a hard question because I know a lot of us are thinking about how do we do more virtual, and that's one of the reasons that we're talking today. But just to get a sense of what we're doing, Abhijit, how are we doing on time there?
So it's about 3, 2, 1. I'm going to stop the poll now. And these are the results for you.
Okay. Pretty good blend. Mostly classroom, 30%, blend 25%, mostly e-learning 25%. And I would expect that what we'll see is virtual and options for additional types of virtual classroom will continue to increase here in the next few weeks and months. So thanks for doing that. One thing to know about polls is generally, as the host, you need to create them in advance. Not always, but you can do some polls on the fly, but it gets a little more complicated. So keep that in mind as you are preparing materials. We're going to spend a few minutes here talking about some really important concepts for preparing for webinars and classes online. The first one that you have here is your invitation with your links. You really want to have a calendar invite that tells people what the meeting is, who's supposed to be there, and how to get into the meeting with the link. That seems obvious, but some of the tools, depending on which one that you use, actually send a little bit of a more generic calendar holder. And so it might have the link, but it perhaps doesn't have the right title. Really depends on the tool. So just keep an eye on that as you're creating your invites. Make it really obvious, and then keep something else in mind. Not everybody is going to be sitting at their laptop or PC and able to join with that audio. They might be in a noisy environment. Last week, my PC audio didn't work, so people couldn't hear me, and I needed a separate dial-in. So when possible, and I understand it's not possible for everybody, include a dial-in so that people have the option to use their phone to dial in and maybe not be able to see the screen. If it's important for you to have people seeing what you're sharing on the screen, make sure you communicate that in the invitation that they need to be prepared to be at a PC and viewing the screen with you during the webinar or the classroom session. Second, set rules. Just like that one, you're going to establish some different rules. It's going to be different for large person webinars where you have a very large group of people, small person webinars, classrooms, and meetings. Go ahead and start figuring out what your rules are and standardize them so that people get their expectations up front. Just like we shared with you that we're going to be keeping video and voice limited and that we'd like you to communicate with us in chat, go ahead and share that information up front. If you've got expectations that even though we're working from home, and a lot of people, it's the first time we want to dress like we're coming to the office, then share that as a rule and help people understand that up front. The next one we want to talk about is probably one of the biggest misses that we see. It's about introductions and attendance. You can't see each other right now. You can see me because I chose to share video on the screen with you, but social cues are really hard even when everybody's on video in the room. So one of the things we want to encourage you to do is give a little structure to how people do introductions. What happens most commonly is we'll get into a session and the facilitator, the host, the teacher, whoever it's going to be that's leading or starting things off will say something like this: oh, why don't we go around and do a round of introductions? That works great if you're in a room where you can figure out who's going next, but in a room where you can't even tell how many people are necessarily in the meeting, or even if you have the participant list next to you, you need a little more guidance. So here's a couple of suggestions. You can call out the names of the individuals and say, hey, Abhijit, can you take a moment to say hi and introduce yourself? Or you can have the participant list up and ask people to go from top to bottom. If you want a little bit more advanced pre-work, you can assign participant numbers so people know what their number is and you go in sequence starting from 1 to X number of participants. That clearly works a little better if you have smaller groups and teams that are joining. But just something to keep in mind because we see it happen a lot. And so when you make that question, we say, let's go around and introduce each other, there's an awkward pause, and then 4 people start talking at once. And that's what you're trying to avoid by making a little bit more structure for people in these meetings. The next thing to keep in mind is be human. It's tough right now for everybody to learn new things, work from home, learn new tools, keep getting work done, deal with the other people, cats, animals, kids that might be home with them as well. So remember to be human. Take a few minutes at the beginning of a meeting to let people just talk. If you were meeting in person, you'd stop and say, hey, how are you? You might join somebody as they walk down the hall to the meeting room. Just a few minutes to let people have a little chit chat. It's harder in the virtual environment because people might not be able to talk over each other, but you can ask questions to individuals and let people chat back and forth in the box just as a way of warming up and making sure that people feel connected to each other. Now, it's also really important if you're doing meetings in a small group setting, like a manager and a direct report, try to use video and definitely make sure you're incorporating some of the same elements that you would if you were in person. Believe it or not, people forget that because we're on a computer or on a phone and we just forget to act human with each other. Another common one that's really important is mute. Okay, so as a host in almost all tools, the admin or host has the right to control mute for all participants. So in this meeting, we set you straight to mute when you came in, and that's something that we can control on an individual and a group level. When you've got class sessions that are maybe 20 or less people, or some of those meetings with smaller folks, you may decide to have mute off, but it's really difficult when people don't hear their own background noise. So frequently you're going to need to remind people to mute often, and you may even have to take over in your participant panel and mute them directly if you don't hear a response. This is something people forget. A key thing to also remember is depending on the tool you're using, if you're dialed in both to the tool so that you can watch the show, or the slides or the videos interacting with others, but you're also dialed in on a phone device, sometimes muting on one will keep you muted on both. And so you may think that people can hear you, but you actually need to unmute on the device. That's going to be completely tool specific. So just play with it depending on what tool that you've got in your environment and sort of figure it out, and then you can add that to the rules and help people understand when they are or are not muted. Screen sharing and screencasting. So I'm sharing my screen with you right now. And one of the things we see people do is choose to share their entire screen or their desktop, which is great because that means if I've got more than one application that I'm going to share with you, I can do it seamlessly, and I have a lot less of that, oh, we can't see what you just switched to, or there's a big gray box in front of the screen. You eliminate a lot of that by doing sharing of your whole desktop. You also, as a great best practice, should log into a separate device if you're the host. So I'm on my laptop right now, but I also have my phone logged in, which those of you who were on broadcast early heard me trying to turn the audio off. But that just lets me see what you're seeing, because I'm going to see different things when I'm logged in as an admin or the host than I will as a participant. So that's a good best practice for you too. If you choose to share your entire screen and all your desktop, that means any application that you have open could be viewed by your participants. So be super careful about that. Try and close your Outlook. A lot of people keep Outlook open during the presentation. You probably don't need it open because you're going to be busy presenting and trying to pay attention and facilitate to the individuals who are in your webinar or class. So if at all possible, keep your Outlook closed. At the very minimum, turn off your notifications. So notifications often pop up in the lower right of your screen, and they'll say things like you've got a new mail or somebody's texting or chatting you. That's going to show up when you're presenting content, and you really want to try and avoid that. So keep that in mind when you're sharing. And then our last one on this screen that's actually going to lead us into the next part of our conversation is about time and content. We deliberately chose a 30-minute webinar. Could we spend more time on this? Absolutely. And we can make it more interactive, give you guys a chance to really get to know each other and do more things. But what's critical is, one, people are busy, and two, it's hard to be in an online session for a period of time. So we're really encouraging you to think about how can you reduce the total amount of time that you need to spend on a topic. Can you do it in smaller components so that people don't have to sit there for long durations? And don't try to fit everything that you would fit in an in-person meeting or class or presentation into a virtual session. Call it, be very precise about it, and then try to adjust your agenda so that you can accomplish it. It's really funny because first thing this morning, somebody was telling me that they were supposed to be in an in-person meeting yesterday, and instead of being in person, it was virtual online, and it was 4 hours back to back. That's very painful. You wouldn't want to do it. So as you're building your programs, keep in mind that your participants don't want to do it either. Now, we're about 18 minutes into this session, and the last 10-ish, not even quite, I've been doing all the talking. It starts to get a little bit awkward for you, right? Like you want a little more interaction. We did some polls, but that's not feeling very comfortable. And so we do that deliberately so you can see that just a short period of time in a session can actually feel quite long to our participants. You really want to add in interactions as much as possible. Let's go back to the concept of content and creating materials when it comes to recorded, self-directed, and live facilitation. Let's start with recorded and self-directed. The important reason that you have a facilitator is because they have some expertise to share with you, or they are coordinating and collaborating with the participants in the room and really ensuring that you're understanding and applying knowledge. You don't need somebody to read information to you. You don't need somebody to sit there and tell you what you can go through yourself. So in a recorded self-directed session, what you want to try and do is use the time when you've got somebody talking to really be explaining concepts, not teaching just the basics, but explaining concepts that you can then step away from that recording and apply information, do an activity, an exercise, etc. Platforms like Coursera, Udemy, other very similar platforms, they have professors that are talking to you in a recorded video. You can include engagement or interaction, like stop and answer a question based on what the professor just answered. Those are great techniques. But you still want to make sure that these videos are relatively short, 10, 20 minutes at most. If you can make them shorter, great. And then have your participant, your learner, go stop and do something, whether that is another activity, a quiz, some application. There's lots of different ways to do it. But in recorded self-directed, you do want to give people a chance to break things up, because it's really hard to sit and watch videos where somebody's talking at you for long periods of time without other elements. Now, over on the other side of the screen, live facilitation, we really would like to share the concept that if you are in a classroom environment, that set of materials you have does not just lift and load to an online virtual WebEx. You really want to go through it and cut materials so that you are bringing people in with your facilitator or with their other participants for sharing, discussion, application, explanation of concepts. But if you can take some of that information and share it in different ways, whether that's recorded, videos that you watch and activities that you watch, whether it's a set of materials that you prepare before you come into the virtual session, those are some excellent ways to make sure that you're still presenting the content that you would do in person, but in a different way that helps us when we're not able to be together. I'm going to add one more element here involving your attendees. Whether it's recorded or live, there are some different elements. So videos, clearly. Whiteboards are a feature that are available in almost all tools, and whiteboards let your participants interact with content on the screen. You can also give control. Again, you want to do this in a trusted environment where you know the participants and their security systems, but you can give control to your participants to do things on your system. So maybe you have an app open or an activity or different elements that you invite people in the room, in your class or in your webinar to actually interact on your system, teach something, show something. And you've got the reverse of that where you can actually have other participants show things that are on their screen, work that they've prepared and brought to class, or presentation that's going to be part of your discussion. Polls, we saw an example of a moment ago, and we'll see an example of using your chat window for questions as opposed to verbal questions. Those are all going to work in a recorded session to a degree, but things like chats and breakouts and discussion really need to be limited to when you bring people into the live session. So breakout rooms, for those of you that don't know, allow you to take participants and have them interacting separately. So we leave this session, it stays open, and 3 or 4 of us go into our own room where we see and talk to each other. We've got our own audio, we can do our own sharing on the screen, and it allows you to do things that you would in the classroom, just like when you say, okay, break up into small groups and practice this. That's what a breakout does online. And so regardless of which tool you use, make sure that you practice in advance on how to put people into breakout rooms before you do it. It's really important to understand what your particular tool's technology does when it comes time for breakouts and for pulling people back in, but a super effective technique for live facilitated sessions. The last one on here is resources. Resources are important because you need to be able to make sure that everybody has what they need when they come into the meeting. If there's something you want them to have access to, show them how to get to it before they join, because it's hard for them to stop their participation and their listening and their engagement with you here to go search for something. A lot of tools also let you, as the host or administrator, share a downloadable in the session. People tend to find that very tricky versus if you've given it to them before, or if you say, hey, during our course or during our webinar, we're going to be pulling resources from this location, a common site that you've got set up like a SharePoint or an LMS site. There's lots of different options for where to put the resources, but helping people know that they need to have that ready and available can really make sure that your session goes a lot smoother and you don't have as many people stopping to say, hey, I can't find it, or can you help me, or can you resend the link, and some of those more common things. So we're going to spend just a few more minutes talking about a couple additional tips for online facilitation that we have in addition to the ones that we've just shared. Before we do that, open up your chat window. It's going to be on your toolbar. And depending if you're on a mobile device, you may need to click participants to get to chat. But open up your chat window and just quickly tell us there, what's your favorite tip? This can be something that you have observed in another session that you've participated in, or it might be something that you personally like to include. Just take a moment and tell us, what do you think? What's your favorite tip for online facilitation? Great. Polls. I see some comments about polls and breakouts, requesting participants to mute their computers and other devices. Helpful. Take just a couple more seconds here in your chat window, which you'll find on your toolbar. Having an agenda and including participation, absolutely. Creating an emotional connection. Somebody wrote, so from the very first morning, creating an emotional connection with your participants. It's so true. And in a webinar, it's a little bit harder, particularly if you are going to start with audio off. So if it's a public webinar where you have a lot of diverse folks that may not be from your organization, a little bit harder to do. But if you're going to do a webinar with people that you know, for example, a cohort, or internal to your organization, absolutely you have lots of ways to do what we would have called an icebreaker in an in-person facilitated session, right? So we'll pause there. Those are some great suggestions that you guys are putting in your chat window. And I'm gonna just flip us to the next screen and give you a couple more to think about. These will be just as we wrap up here. One, in a classroom, you might give people a participant manual. They might have different materials on the table, but in a virtual session, it's really hard to split your attention. You are listening to somebody talk to you, potentially presenting additional information on the screen, so avoid splitting people's attention. If you've got text on the screen that they need to read, you need to pause and let people read it. Give them time, tell them that it's there. Don't talk or show things while they're also supposed to be paying attention to that. In the same way, it's very hard to use an online participant manual that is separate from the tool. So unless you have two screens available, and most of our audiences do not, you need to toggle between applications or have a printed copy. So keep that in mind when you're asking people to look at things. They usually can focus on the screen in front of them, and then they need a pause and dedicated time to do the next step. Second, try to limit talking heads and encourage or increase engagement. Particularly in a large group webinar, you can do this in a couple of ways. We looked at a couple of those techniques on the prior screen. In general, if you feel like your facilitation from your subject matter expert or your teacher, the person who's going to lead the session, is really critical, try to introduce periods where you can break and engage within that section, or decrease the total duration of the time of that video so people can stop and go and do something else. The third key tip is preparing and practicing. Make sure that you know your materials really well so you don't have to read, so that you understand what's coming next. Go into the tool that you're actually going to select and present in and practice there. Try to have somebody else come in with you so you can do the polls and actually know how it's going to come across to your audience. So prepare and practice just like you would before you go into a classroom or another meeting, but online, is particularly when people are learning the tools, you might want to put a little bit extra time in there when you're just getting started. And to the same degree, so that's for hosts and presenters, but for your participants, onboard them. You would not invite a new employee to the office without saying, hey, here's where you get coffee, this is where you can get extra supplies, let me introduce you to some critical people. To move folks online, you need to spend some time helping them understand the tool you've selected, how it works, what your rules and expectations are. So onboard people to your virtual environment just like you would in real life. And last, make sure that any materials they need, everybody has a common understanding of how to get to them, what to bring to the session in advance, or where to go after the session to get any follow-on materials for their next activity. Make it as clear as possible, because you will have a little bit less time to help each individual participant when you're in the online session if you have to stop and answer additional questions. Last, if you can have an assistant or somebody else in the room with you to monitor the chat, help answer questions, help run some of the polls, it's an excellent idea. Just makes it a little bit easier when you're trying to concentrate on a lot of different components online. So that's it for tips. We want to thank you for being here with us today. We're going to keep the call open for a few minutes after. In case you have questions, you can put them in the chat, and Abhijit and I will stay here and answer them, but we want to be respectful of your time and end on time here. We do have 2 other sessions coming up, so you'll get an offer to attend Go Digital by leveraging learning technologies, or Reinforce Knowledge through games. We'll send you links to register for that information in case you'd like to We'd love to see you in those sessions as well. If you have other topics or questions you'd like to see us have a webinar or a panel on, please feel free to let us know. And we will be sending out to the same email that you registered with a copy of these materials. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining. We're going to go ahead and say if you need to leave, please feel free. If you'd like to stay and enter questions into the chat window, then we are going to, Abhijit and I are going to stay online and try and answer those for a few minutes. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Anna. There are a couple of questions that are coming up which have come in directly. One very interesting one is, it's an interesting background that you have, Anna. So is that a picture, an image?
Yeah, so these are mountains in Chile. This is a picture from a vacation we took several years ago. In Zoom, there is this awesome feature that lets you pick your own background and upload it. They have a couple available ones. Not all tools do this, but Zoom does. So you could have your kids in the background, a flower meadow, whatever you wanted to upload. It's just a fun feature.
One more quick question is, what kind of tools do we typically recommend as best for a VI?
As best for what was the?
For VI, for virtual classroom? Virtual classroom.
So tools from the perspective of a platform, the ones that we put on the screen. So if the question is about tools, about how to present like a Zoom or a GoToMeeting, there's a lot of benefit, pros and cons to each. Most of the time, the decision about which one you can use tends to be up to IT. So we can talk about some of the features for that independently with you, but in general, they're all going to enable this. The most important one I would say is make sure you have access to breakout rooms. Not all tools enable breakout rooms, and so if you're looking to do classes online, or if you're looking to do really engaging webinars where your participants get to interact with each other, make sure you pick a tool that has breakout rooms.
Perfect. One question was that, can we have a training session on how to use Zoom effectively?
Yeah, so Zoom is super interesting. There are, for all the tools, there are a lot of materials available on the actual tool site that will teach you through video or through instructions and text about all the different features. 100% we recommend that whoever's going to host and facilitate goes in and learns the host features, and that you also create some quick onboarding tips that you can share and leverage with your participants so that they also understand how to use the tool. If that's something that you guys want help with, we can try and create some additional sessions, but I think tool-specific training is probably available online in most cases already.
Perfect. Well, there are quite a few questions, but I'm going to limit that to two in the interest of time. One is, how long, based on MPS's experience, how long do you recommend the duration of a VILT should be in order to make it more effective for people?
Yeah. So the tricky thing about trying to take Classroom into an online environment is you often need a lot of time. Most people do not like to sit in a webinar session that is more than an hour and a half. And that's even when you've included variety, engaging, polls, questions, discussion, etc. So if you're going to try and transfer from Classroom to online, keep that as the marker. So an hour to an hour and a half. If you've got more content than that, have a break. Let people move away and come back in at another session. So for example, you could do that as 1 hour every morning for 4 days, and then you've got your class covered. Or you could do an hour and a half in the morning, have people go away and come back for an hour and a half. I know it's really enticing to invite people to just come and sit through 3 hours and let's just knock it out. But no matter how much engagement you have, it's going to be really hard. It's a different mindset and physical requirement than being in a classroom and getting the energy from others in the room. So generally speaking, that's what we would suggest, and you can chunk that into different formats as well for time. Are there more questions?
So that's one more question coming up is, you've provided some great activity options, but again, based on your experience, are there any kind of activities that you recommend could be really effective in which?
So there's actually a lot more than what we've shown here. For example, one thing that we recently created for a customer is a word scramble. So everybody's got scrambled words. You guys know what that is. It's like you got to take the letters and unmix them to figure out what the word is. It was critical because we were teaching specific words. That was part of the lesson. So your activities need to support the objectives that you're trying to teach. But so everybody had a chance on screen. We had the scrambled words, and then we were able to go through and unscramble them. You can do a lot with your content in a virtual environment. The ones that we listed there are the most common, but what you do in a breakout room, whether that is individual coaching, role play, working in an application, there are so many different ways to make sure that you're creating really engaging and interesting content that isn't just somebody talking to you and you taking notes, but you're actually learning and working together. Lots of options for that.
Perfect. So we do have quite a few questions coming in, but again, in the interest of time, I know we're past 7 minutes. So folks, what we are going to do is we are going to curate all the questions that have come and provide our responses to it and make it available to everyone early next week, along with this recording of the webinar. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you again, folks. Stay well.